Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Let's begin with an examination of research into just how likely we are to be successful with a vaccination effort for the CCP virus. The leading hope at the moment is that at some point in the very near future, we will have a vaccine that will allow us to immunize the majority of the population against the CCP virus. This will mitigate many of the issues we're currently seeing. It will also avoid the need for things like social distancing, masks, lockdowns, and so on. That's the hope in theory. The problem we're going to face is the same problem we face with many other vaccines. There is a lot of pushback and resistance. Anti-vaxxers exist, and they are a problem. Although officially anti-vaxxers are called vaccine hesitant, realistically, they're simply idiots, for the most part, or those who have had undue experiences that have led them to believe that all vaccines are evil. Surveys across the world looking at 20 countries try to figure out just how likely people in those countries are to take the vaccine if offered. Overall, the figures are not encouraging. The 20 countries chosen were some of the most impacted by the CCP virus, and you would think logically these countries would be more likely to take the vaccine given the impact it's had on them. Despite this impact, over 10% of China is adverse to the idea of taking a vaccine for the CCP virus. This figure skyrockets to over 45% in Russia. While the scope in between is rather drastic, it does highlight just how serious the issue of getting people to take the vaccine for the CCP virus once they start being produced and made available is going to be. While we might have a vaccine, we also need to look at how we're going to deal with the CCP virus here and now. That's where some of the current treatments come in. One of these is called Remdesivir, and it is an antiviral used for other virus-based diseases. Clinical trials of Remdesivir for the CCP virus were promising, and little has been heard about it until now, where the FDA has given full approval. This is an important milestone. We now have a practical, viable, and readily available treatment. That means we can begin giving it to patients, hopefully with the premise that it will reduce the severity and duration of the disease. This is particularly useful when we're looking at how we can mitigate the immediate impact of the CCP virus. The immediate impact is going to be for those who are sick, but it doesn't take away from the issue that we have many public health concerns above and beyond the illness itself. How do you prevent infection, exchange, and so on? This last point is particularly important. Remdesivir is given via injection in hospitals. This means that we're not addressing the issue of overloading the medical system, and that does mean that we're unlikely to see a reduction in the social limitations currently in place in order to stop the spread of the virus. If they were taken away, even with a treatment like Remdesivir, we would not be seeing the hospitals being able to cope. And so, without the medical system available to absorb the massive increase in cases, those limitations will remain. The other concern, although not as serious overall, is that it is possible that we may not be able to keep up production for the massive surge in need for it. Add to this that with a vaccine on the horizon in theory, we may well not need that sudden increase in capacity for production. This means that the supply and stockpile as it exists now may only be a temporary measure. Hopefully, it'll be something that can be produced more efficiently and cheaper going forward, with a reason now to try and find better ways and more efficient ways to make it. While on the topic of the spread and infection of the CCP virus, there's been an article in The Conversation looking at just how likely we are to reach a point at which there are 0 CCP virus cases. Attempts to eliminate it have been almost successful. We say almost successful because it is important to note that most countries that have reached the official 0 case reading have then had cases appear out of seemingly nowhere. New Zealand being the perfect example where after 100 days, without any identifiable cases, they suddenly started popping up. It seems the only way to be able to do that is for countries to enter into isolation. Isolation is theoretically possible, but practically impossible. This owes to the fact that many countries are landlocked without secure borders, have to import goods, and more factors that mean people will be moving regardless. The immunologist that writes this article draws a very good comparison between efforts at eliminating other diseases like smallpox and polio. Consider that it took nearly 200 years for us to get this close to eradicating smallpox. That's 200 years since the first vaccine was developed. It's also taken us more than 30 years with what is effectively modern medication, distribution channels, and delivery to try and get polio eradicated from almost the entire world. And that's with the World Health Organization backing a big eradication program. Something like the CCP virus, which is even harder to treat, might be more of an issue. And this explains why we're facing such a big problem. People will often say it's not that serious an issue. What they don't seem to understand is, okay, it may not have hit you very hard, and it may not impact the younger people very hard. But what are you going to do to actually remove it entirely? Because you're going to get older, and if the CCP virus is still in circulation as you age, chances are it's going to have more of an impact on you. And if more exposure gives you more risk, this is not going to be like influenza, where the mortality rate is much lower. The fact that there are some people who are at least relatively unaffected by the CCP virus is what's given rise to some interesting ideas in the UK. Researchers have proposed that they begin testing the CCP virus in healthy volunteers. That is, they want to find out just how much of the virus is needed and in what sort of delivery mechanism to infect people. The first way they want to test this is a nasal delivery, which is theoretically one of the most common routes for infection and currently thought to be the most likely way someone is infected. This kind of human research is very strictly limited and restricted. The risk of there being severe adverse reactions, or worse yet, severe infections from the CCP virus means that the researchers can only use very healthy young volunteers. It appears they're looking for people between the ages of roughly 20 and 30 who have no underlying health conditions. This means that they can only really figure out what happens in those young healthy people, the group of people who are least likely to have a severe infection, but also, ironically enough, the group of people who, if they develop a severe infection, are likely to have the most pronounced complications. While on the topic of the CCP virus, unintended consequences, and trying to understand what's happening, there's been some interesting new examinations of the current vaccines under trial. Some of them are more likely than others. The concern is that some of the current vaccines, particularly those in clinical trials, use a particular method that could theoretically increase the risk for infection by the HIV-1. That's a virus as well, and the issue comes from researchers who are trying to figure out a vaccine for that virus. The issue is that most vaccines need some sort of way to deliver the particular thing they're going to use to immunize the host. Generally, this is called a vector, and the vector has to get to where it's going. Historically, different viruses have been used, primarily retroviruses, but more recently adenoviruses have been used for the same reason. By creating an adenovirus that is modified to be something that exhibits the same markers as the CCP virus but has none of the mortality or pathogenicity to it, you can more or less activate the immune system with something benign, get it trained up and ready to deal with the actual virus when it comes along. This is where the issue with just exactly what you're using comes in. The adenoviruses in particular appear to activate the immune system in a way that would give the HIV more locations where it could, in theory, not only infect, but also hide from the immune system. In fact, Dr. Fauci has advised caution when using the adenoviruses as a way to develop vaccines. Although a concern, it is not the only possible thing to be aware of, but it is a cautionary point that needs to be followed very carefully, and it would appear from what most companies are reporting, they are aware of the concern and are working on modifying the adenovirus to make it both safer and more effective for the desired purpose. Once the clinical trials are finished, or at least this batch of them, we should have some idea on how safe and effective it is. Going now from CCP virus news, we can look at an obituary, or specifically an obituary about someone who spent most of their life debunking various claims. James Randi was someone who spent his life investigating and then trying to point out how faith healers, psychics, charlatans, and many who claim to have powers outside the normal were simply creating their own false illusions, making things up, and ultimately full of it. He died at the age of 92, having spent most of his time initially as an escape artist and a magician, presumably having become bored with that and understanding just how easy sleight of hand is. He eventually went on to start looking at the claims various people have made. In the 70s, he, along with the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov and the astronomer Carl Sagan, created what is now known as the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And this was there not only to promote scientific inquiry, but to investigate claims of paranormal phenomena. It is perhaps this quote from 1981 that best summarizes James Randi. The difference between them and me is that I admit that I am a charlatan. They don't. I don't have time for things that go bump in the night. While James Randi may not have had time for quackery, many others do, and in the modern world, the internet has made it possible for quacks and pseudo-scientific nonsense to be sold freely. CBD oil is just exactly one of these. It's often sold as a cure-all to anything and everything that could possibly go wrong with you. The problem is that it is a cannabis-derived product that has taken out the primary active ingredient from cannabis. There have been various trials throughout the year into what is considered a supplement. We say supplement, not medication, because it is very specifically separately registered as a product. The claims made for it are very different than what are made for a medicine, and being a supplement, the body of evidence required to substantiate those claims is substantially lower. This is where some of the research into it comes in. There are not only many testimonials, which are useless anecdotal evidence, but also there have been a number of trials in different ways to try and figure out just what it can be used for. The trials have also been relatively inconsistent, finding either minor benefits in some cases or none in others. Despite this lack of evidence, people continue to sell it, and we go back to these anecdotes. One particular study began looking at whether or not people on Reddit would have either known what it was good for or been able to substantiate why they thought it was of any use. This led many of the people on the subreddit to begin using it for a range of conditions for which there is little to no evidence. This ranges from things like heart conditions through to psychiatric conditions, sexual dysfunction, and more, which again, they lack the evidence to be able to follow through. The lack of evidence means people are taking CBD oil in lieu of proven efficacious medication. Going now from medical news to archaeology, scientists have discovered a giant picture of a cat. This in and of itself is weird, but not that interesting. What is interesting is that it's one of the Nazca lines. These are giant pictures drawn 2,000 years ago in Peru. The picture itself is also, when we say giant, 37 meters long. The cat image is among some of the older possible Nazca line specimens. One of the major reasons why it was slow to be discovered compared to the others is that this image is found on a hillside, and as it's on a hillside, erosion is causing parts of the image to disappear. Those that are found on the plains survive better for several reasons, one of which is a lack of erosion, water movement, and wind. It means the lines don't get covered up with dirt. Further to that, there's a layer of lime which hardens when exposed to small amounts of moisture. This means that they become quite substantial in short order. In other news, Australia is about to become host to a giant solar farm. Interestingly enough, Australia itself won't be the beneficiary of said solar farm. The entire system is designed to send power off to Singapore, and part of the $20 billion facility is the power farm itself. But then there is another massive part of that investment going to building a huge power supply system going all the way from nearly the center of Australia all the way up to Singapore. The entire system will be of little value though without a battery to match it, and so you now have 3 major infrastructure projects. The first being the giant solar farm. Then there will be power lines running 750 kilometers to the coast of North Australia, where there is a giant battery set up. From here, it will need to travel another 3,700 kilometers to reach Singapore. The next piece of news takes us to space, where we appear to have finally found where the ISS has been leaking atmosphere. The leak has been going on since 2019. In August of 2020, the leak became more pronounced, and this became a more serious concern, where resupplying the space station was no longer a practical solution in the long term. Having been able to narrow it down to a handful of locations, but lacking the necessary equipment to figure out where to go, the astronauts on the ISS had to use their creativity. They did this by using tea leaves. A few tea leaves released from the tea bag would then float towards where atmosphere was leaving as they would be drawn towards that space. By following them, almost like breadcrumbs, they were able to figure out just exactly where they were leaking the atmosphere from. It turns out that in the communications module, there was what appeared to be a scratch. That wasn't a scratch. It was instead a crack in the wall of the ISS, and this is where the atmosphere is leaking from. The solution was almost comical in a way. While the meme may be that flex tape solves everything, they instead used Captain tape. If the ISS does not continue to lose atmosphere, then clearly this was the only issue. But recalling last week's What Were They Thinking, we highlighted that the majority of the Russian modules have an estimated lifetime of up to 15 years. They have now been attached to the ISS for nearly 20 years. This means the number of instances where we see something like atmosphere leaking out are only going to increase as things go forward. The final piece of news we have for you this week is an update on just what happened with the pieces of space debris that we spoke about last week. There was a dead satellite in space and part of a Chinese booster rocket. These were both traveling towards each other, and they were both very large. The consequences of a collision would have been debris creating a chain reaction of damage to other satellites. Many of these other satellites are currently in use. Worse yet if it had been able to hit the ISS, where it could have easily caused massive destruction and loss of life. The good news is that these two particular craft managed to miss each other, which is great. There's unlikely to be that chain reaction of destruction. This does, however, not address the fact that there is still a massive belt of debris in space. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.